All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm delighted that you are here on, well, we don't quite have a blizzard. We just have a teaser this afternoon. But it's good to see so many people here for Sanchita's talk, because, you know, this is a very important topic and a very important book. So Sanchita in a moment will discuss the new work that she has recently completed. And when I was reading it, I thought, my goodness, you know, sometimes really difficult things happen when you're a scholar. And she was writing and working on this book so hard and had it finished, and then the accident at Rana Plaza took place. And it's a terrible thing. You think to yourself, oh my gosh, you know, I'm going to have to rewrite the entire book, and it's not going to hold up, and no one's going to want to read it because there's nothing about Rana Plaza in the book. So fortunately, she caught her publisher just in time, and so the last 4 or 5 pages of the book, I'm pleased to say, are reflections on Rana Plaza and the connectivity between your thesis and the book in its main form. So let me just introduce Sanchita Banerjee Saxena. And she is Executive Director of the Institute for South Asia Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, and the Director of the Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies under the ISAS. That's a lot. Sanchita received her PhD from UCLA, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how long did it take you to work on this book?
This book, about 5 years.
About 5 years, okay. So, you know, that's an awful long and substantial commitment, and I think it's a very interesting story that you have, so please share it with us, and then we will have a couple of discussants, and then we will open it up to everybody here.
Okay,
so
wonderful.
Please. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to everyone here at the South Asia Institute for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really great to be here, actually. I'm actually surprised that I made it from California yesterday. Very smooth. Let's see how it is when I go back, but it is great to be here. So yes, I mean, I actually just kind of following up on what John just mentioned, the book really was sort of almost ready to submit when the Rana Plaza disaster happened. And then I literally had to, you know, tell the publisher, a book on this subject cannot come out without, you know, some mention of it. The problem is, though, that it happened and there was very little time for any analysis, because it was literally unfolding as we spoke. And even now, I mean, how much can we really say, you know, post Rana Plaza, what has happened, you know, how effective the various, you know, groups have been? It's still questionable. It's still, you know, in progress. So that's often difficult when, you know, you're writing about things that are so current and literally unfolding as you speak. But anyway, I look forward to making this presentation, then I look forward to your questions afterwards. So just very briefly about how this project started. I actually can remember almost the day when I sort of got interested in this topic broadly. It was 2004, and I was at the Asia Foundation at the time. And I remember my then boss called me kind of frantically from Asia and said, you know, I've been in the region and there's a lot of buzz everywhere about the multi-fiber arrangement. It's going to expire, and we really need to do something, and there's a lot of talk, and I kind of said, okay, great, you know, we'll put something together. And I quickly Googled multi-fiber arrangement. I did not know what it was. I did not know how important it was for the region, not just Asia, obviously, but, you know, many parts of the world. And it was really then that I started thinking about sort of the MFA. And the MFA, I'm sure many of you know, but for those of you who do not, it's the multi-fiber arrangement. It was a system of quotas that were in place for more than 40 years that basically governed the trade of garments and textiles. And it was kind of created by the global north to try to sort of prevent an influx of exports from the global south, sort of to control that. But the the effects of that were varied. I mean, in countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Cambodia, they did not expect to be sort of leading exporters of garments. But because of the quotas were in place, it sort of created these industries. In other cases, like some of the countries in East Asia, it sort of created, it sort of limited what they would export. They probably could have exported much more, but it really sort of constrained that. So it had various, sort of interesting effects of what became sort of, it was basically a trade distortion that was created. And so it was over, from 2004, what started as sort of a series of programs trying to bring in various groups in sort of, we looked at 8 sort of the smaller Asian countries, so not sort of excluding China and India, but really looking at countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan and Cambodia and Nepal and saying, what do these countries need to do once the quotas have expired? How will they move forward? And we started, the idea of coalition building, what I talk about in the book, actually stemmed from some of the programmatic activities we did at that time. So we really brought in groups from the private sector, from government, from NGOs and women's groups and labor rights groups, and started saying, what if you just, have a dialogue, talk about what are some of the reforms that need to be made in the sector, what are some key issues, how would you work together? And from that point it started, and it became sort of an interesting question over time to post 2005, as I was going back to the region for several times. It started in Bangladesh actually, and then started going to the other countries. It started seeing very significant changes actually taking place. But it didn't seem like there was a lot being written about it, either in the academic literature and the policy literature. So that became kind of an interesting sort of impetus for the book, as well as kind of the comparison. So what I'll talk about a little bit later is the 3 countries were chosen because, one, they all sort of did well post-MFA. So they didn't fall off the map as everyone kind of expected. They did well in terms of exports continued to European and to European countries and the U.S. But they varied quite a bit. There's quite a bit of variation in terms of the coalition and the organization and the role of labor in these 3 countries. And that actually became a very interesting sort of question. And one of the very interesting findings of the book is really how the role of labor is different in these 3 countries. So I'll talk about that in more detail. So just very quickly on research methodology. So I use sort of qualitative and quantitative methodologies. I did more than 100 interviews across the 3 countries with labor NGOs and trade unions, government ministries, employers federations, factory owners, middle managers. Also did focus groups with workers, so 17 formal and informal focus groups with 85 workers across the 3 countries. And then a quantitative survey. It was, ideally we could have increase the number. I mean, it was 100 workers, from 10 factories in each country, and the idea was really to get. It was a very short survey. The idea was really to look at sort of trends in terms of how they felt they were able to impact change at the factory level, and sort of the ideas of coalition building that I bring up in the book. So it wasn't as comprehensive as it could have been, and this is something, at some point I would like to do at a much larger scale, but it was just to try to capture some trends that, and sort of compare across country. And then I was able to do sort of informal factory tours. Again, these were not sort of formalized, but I was able to see informally, conditions in the different factories. And then I spent time in Washington, D.C. and did research on the issues of trade policy. And the book is the study is in a way sort of framed by U.S. trade policy towards these countries. So starting with sort of the expiration of the MFA and kind of ending with current policies that are in place that still continue to restrict the trade of garments and textiles. If we have time towards the end, I'll mention a little bit of that. So as I mentioned, 2004 was a big year of anxiety for many of these countries because the quotas were finally going to expire in 2005. And there was a lot of pessimism around what was going to happen post-MFA. So most people really thought that, the policy folks and academics were all saying most of these countries are going to, all of these countries, in fact, are going to fall off the map. They're completely, their industries are going to become, they're going to disappear. It's really China and then second, India are going to just take over. Now, of course, a lot of, that was really a lot of doom and gloom, but it didn't really happen that way. So of course, China, did well as to be expected. But if you look, this is data, following the phase out, some of these sort of unexpected countries actually continue to maintain market share. And they didn't, and the countries that sort of lost out immediately were some of the East Asian countries. So just a quick comparison between the three countries that I look at here, and just to give you an idea of the, kind of the scale and the size of the sector in each of these countries. So in Bangladesh, there's 4 million employed. This is 2013 data. 4 million employed, 5,000 factories, and this is registered factories. These are officially registered. So there is a whole subsector of subcontractors that I don't even think we have data for. I don't know, Fawzia, if you know if we have this data. I think it's very tough to get and count. Yes. And this is a big issue in Bangladesh that ties in with kind of the last chapter, which talks about Rana Plaza, and hopefully we'll have a discussion about that. But 5,000 factories really means sort of the registered official factories. 80% of the country's exports, although I've seen this figure higher in some other citations, and then 95% are local investors, so Bangladeshi investors. In Sri Lanka, this is 2010 data, so about 400,000 employed. It hasn't changed too much, I believe. About 850 factories, 50% of the country's exports. So Sri Lanka, compared to these other two countries, is really a lot more diversified. And about 85% local investors. In Cambodia, so it's a much smaller industry, but about 236 factories. It's 80% of the country's exports, and only 5% are local investors. So most of the garment owners in Cambodia are actually foreigners. So they're from Korea, from China, from Taiwan, Hong Kong. So very few are local investors, and that has actually a lot of implications for how the sector is going to move forward in terms of integrating labor into the larger policy discussions and sort of the motivations behind making the coalition larger. I think that in Cambodia it's a slightly different scenario than the other two countries. So just in a very sort of simple way, I wanted to show this sort of stages of development into what I'm calling a network in this domestic coalitions approach. Now, I just wanted to mention, so it starts with an international trigger, in this case, sort of the end of the MFA. And it leads to sort of an expanding of the network as a necessary response to this international shock. And then the changing role of the state in terms of responsiveness to other groups, and then increased mechanisms for dialogue among stakeholders. So one of the chapters really talks about ways that groups are connected or able to continue their dialogue or have interaction. And then finally, seeing certain policy changes that are impacting the sector. Now, the policy network approach is sort of it's an established approach in the public policy literature, but the cases tend to be generally applied to U.S. cases in Europe, and there is a small but emerging body of literature that's actually using this approach to apply it to cases in the global South. And so I thought it was a very useful approach because it looks at the relationship between interest groups and the state and how they interact with one another and how they how groups can impact policy, but how also the state must find it necessary to include these groups. And I think that's kind of key for sort of the argument that that I present in the book. It's both a state approach as well as an interest group approach, not saying that they're connected, not that they are working separately. And I thought that was very useful for sort of understanding the industry. So 4 key findings, and I want to talk in detail about 3. So the first is really the changing role of labor in the coalition. All these 3 countries is very significant. I mean, as most of you know who work in this area, for years, labor groups and labor issues were hardly mentioned, in part. It was a very strong coalition between the private sector and the government. So sort of the policymakers giving various policy incentives for the factory owners and to export and to continue to export. There was very little mention of labor issues at all, or integration of labor groups and their influence in the policy process. So it's just simply their changing role, or the changing role of labor as it varies amongst the three countries, just in the coalition in and of itself is significant. The second thing is there are various channels and mechanisms that are essential to ensure representation. And I'll give two examples of, in the three countries, different types of, so that having a private sector organization in place, all three countries have that, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're serving as a credible channel for linking the groups together. It can vary just based on the private sector organization or the representation of labor. There may be channels present, but again, that may vary amongst the countries. The third and fourth findings were really sort of important findings, and very, sort of, I guess, in every researcher has this sort of aha moments in their research when things sort of kind of start making sense. And for me, these were those moments when going into it, I had a certain concept about how improved conditions would relate to workers' empowerment. I sort of assumed that if worker conditions or factory conditions are better comparatively, then workers must be empowered. But this in fact is not true, and it's actually quite the opposite. So I'll talk about that. And then finally, top-down programs with the idea to improve labor conditions often actually limit coalition building in the country. And that was also an interesting finding, which I'll mention. So in terms of channels, and I'm talking just very briefly, I want to give this example. I don't want to, glorify the BGMEA or the BKMEA, but it is important to note that over the years, their mandate has slightly shifted. So, they are the Bangladeshi private sector organization, and registered factories are members of the BGMEA, or the BKMEA should be there too. So for knitwear, there's a separate organization. And for years, they've been representing factory owners, and they've been sort of liaising between owners and the government and trying to push for certain policy incentives, basically, to continue their exports. But over the last few years, and again, I don't want to overglorify this and say it's really, altruistic of them, but I think partly just out of necessity, they've had to broaden their mandate and try to bring in labor and try to work towards sort of facilitating dialogue between owners and workers. They've actually taken some sort of steps in doing management worker trainings. They've started to play more of an advocacy role, so not just looking at certain policies that are going to improve exports, but like a little bit broader, trying to look at labor issues, but also broader to improve the sector. So this is something of a shift, I think, that's happened maybe, more recently in the last 5 years, but even over the last 10 years. And again, because I've said this before, and I've had people sort of come back at me and say, no, don't glorify what they're. So I'm saying, I'm not glorifying what they're doing. There's a long way to go, but I think it's important to recognize that there has been this. It's a conscientious shift, and again, the motivations are very much, out of necessity. It's a business decision. But it's a little covering it up. But so the JAF is the equivalent in Sri Lanka, the private sector organization. And the JAF is a very powerful organization. It's very highly regarded, has very strong links with the government. But they tend they still haven't involved themselves in serving as a link with labor groups and the government, or doing any sort of trainings, or they don't really take on labor issues. So for example, in interview with Mass Holdings, an executive of Mass Holdings, that's the largest apparel factory in Sri Lanka. He said the private sector, government, and buyers are part of the network. Workers are recipients of policies, but not members of the network. And that's a very common sort of refrain that I heard in Sri Lanka when talking to many of the large factories and the owners. They really feel like there is a strong coalition that has existed and that continues to exist between the private sector and the government. But again, labor has not really found its way, nor have they had JAF members, tried to play this role of advocating for labor issues. That's just not a part of their mandate. Whether that will change, perhaps, but maybe not. So it hasn't so far. the GMAC is the equivalent in Cambodia, and GMAC is very interesting. In Cambodia, they are not considered to be powerful as the other two organizations really at all, nor are they really seen as a productive link with the private sector and labor. So, for example, a middle manager in a garment factory says, we have to be a member of GMAC. And remember, Cambodia only has about 230 some factories. So, it's very easy to know who is doing what. And so they're all members of GMAC. But GMAC doesn't act as usefully as it's supposed to. It's not very helpful. And again, these are very common sort of the private sector, the owners and the managers tend to find it's an obligation. They have to be a part of the association, but they're not really doing much to help them out. And in a trade union representative, GMAC has no power to influence the decisions made by its members. GMAC did nothing to protect workers due to its lack of power. GMAC just does paperwork. So a lot of frustration amongst workers and in those in the labor movement that GMAC has never really helped when they've come, to GMAC with issues. They've not responded or they've not been effective. So this is just an example in the three countries to show, the private sector organizations, they're in place and they have a certain mandate and certain goals, but it really is different in terms of how it will play out in terms of representing those who have been excluded, primarily labor for so many years. And then the representation of labor is also varies in the three countries. So in Bangladesh, we were having this discussion over lunch, and maybe we'll talk about it more in the discussion in the Q&A. But unions, it's very, it's a difficult sort of assessment. Unions in some ways have been effective and helpful, but on the other hand, unions have in South Asia in general, I think, are often very male-dominated. They're often very political. They're often, in the garment industry, oftentimes are run by professional union workers who've never worked in the garment factories. So how effective they are and what their ultimate goal is, and do they really represent female workers, is questionable, I think. Although I don't want to make a blanket statement, because I think there are in cases where workers have said, unions have been very helpful for them. But one of the things I think that is interesting in Bangladesh, and that's different from the other two countries, is that the alternative there is a space for an alternate union movement, an alternative to a union movement, which is the garment worker federations. I think those were really been influential in terms of, one, representation of women is a lot more. The federations are larger sort of umbrella bodies, so they include some unions, but they also include NGOs, they include women's groups. So they're a lot more egalitarian in terms of their management structure, but they also tend to be run by former factory owners. So they actually, factory workers. So they actually know the reality of what the working conditions are. In Bangladesh, also one of the interesting things I found in just informal sort of like focus groups, but also it came out in some of our surveys, is that there are these informal mechanisms that it's not really captured in sort of any official, it's not an official forum, it's not an official group, but it's just informal ways that owners are interacting with labor over the last 10 years. It's been a shift. So when we're talking to garment workers who've been in factories, who actually have experience, say, 15 plus years, they really point to a difference that owners kind of listen to them more, or they interact with them more. They're trying to come to the factories. I mean, that was a big thing. A lot of times owners didn't even know what was happening on their factory floor. So just that sheer sort of coming and interacting has also, I think, contributed to some of the changes that we've seen in Bangladesh. And again, this is not captured in any formal way, but sort of an informal way that I think is important. In Sri Lanka, there has been really since the 70s very limited role for unions. At one time, there was a very strong sort of union movement, but the role of unions has been very limited. In the garment industry, instead of unions, unions are very much discouraged, actually. They have set up employee councils in the factories, and these are they've been set up to deal with any grievances that might take place amongst workers and management. But most of the workers, really all of the workers that we spoke to, were very kind of disillusioned with the idea of employees' councils. They thought that they were in place largely because they had to have something in place in the factories, but they were not very effective. And there wasn't any real follow-up. That was the problem. So they would bring in Sri Lanka. One of the biggest issues that came up in terms of generally factory conditions were okay in sort of the day-to-day, in the actual factories. But the housing was a problem for many of the garment workers. So they really found the housing situation to be difficult. Many were coming from outside of Colombo, and that was an issue that they wanted to address, but they really didn't feel that was, the employees' councils were not really addressing it, or there was not a proper way for them to address the, housing issue. That was just sort of one example. The other mechanism in Sri Lanka is really suggestion boxes that are in place in all the factories. But again, this is something that, suggestion boxes there's very little sort of accountability. I mean, you can put your suggestion, but there's no follow-up necessarily. And so these are things that are in place. If you talk to the JAF members, the private sector organization, they'll point to the councils and the suggestion boxes as official ways to involve labor, as official ways to, sort of hear labor and labor to have a voice, labor groups. But if you talk to workers and even some of the labor organizers, they really feel that this is not a viable mechanism and really a credible mechanism to represent labor. And Cambodia, kind of in contrast, actually has a large number of unions. In fact, every factory has a number of unions, and there's 230 some factories, and so each factory has several unions. So the effectiveness of unions has really been tarnished. I mean, a lot of the factory workers sort of rolled their eyes and said, well, there are tons of unions, but are they able to do anything? I mean, there's a lot of inner fighting amongst unions. And in Cambodia, they also tend to be very political. They're actually aligned with the political party in power or the opposition. So it's very hard. It's still difficult for, in spite of all these unions present, it's still difficult for factory workers in Cambodia to really feel that they're able to have a voice, or they're able to influence any change at the factory or at the policy level. So this is just a real quick from the survey. So this was, we asked mechanism in factories in Bangladesh for dialogue with the owner. And for, especially for the smaller factories, about 57% said informal mechanisms. And I think that's more common probably amongst the smaller factories. And about, in total, about 37%. So informal sort of dialogue with the owner is something sort of significant in Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, this is just an example of, this is a part of a longer quote from a garment factory worker. The factory was part of a union 10 years ago in 2000. At that time, there was good representation of the union. Then it became inactive, and the management tried to bust the union. Workers from the factory approached the labor ministry to complain. Then a workers' council was elected. There are meetings, but nothing gets resolved. So, and again, this is part of a longer dialogue with in a focus group. But this is kind of an example of sort of, what the purpose of a union was, and then actually what the workers' council has become, in terms of its effectiveness. And this is an example from our survey in terms of most efficient mechanisms for workers to influence change in Sri Lanka. And it was quite surprising that 47% said suggestion boxes is really seen as the most effective mechanism for change in Sri Lanka. And then Cambodia, as I mentioned, the unions are very, very aligned with political parties. So a garment factory worker says meetings between employers and employees are only held due to conflicts. There are no regular meetings. When new factories are established in Cambodia, the government persuades them into joining the pro-government trade unions. So they're kind of, they kind of have to join, I think, one of the many unions in the factories. But again, they don't see it as very effective. So I'm just going to skip this. So the third point that I had as one of the key findings was the delinking the concepts of improved labor conditions and worker empowerment. So in Bangladesh, historically, the conditions have been dismal. I mean, there have been a lot of improvements in the last 5 years, especially amongst the registered factories. I mean, they're now all pretty much have to be compliant. But again, we're sort of not talking about the subcontracting, sector, which is very hard to measure and very hard to make compliant. But generally, the compliant, the register factories are compliant. But historically, Bangladesh has been known for dismal conditions. I mean, that's what the media has really, sort of highlighted constantly. And so you do have a certain impression of what the sector is like. But if you look at certain aspects of sort of what we call workers' empowerment, so actually workers feeling like they are able to make a change, you see that in Bangladesh. I mean, this came out of our survey, and there's other evidence. It was quite interesting and quite significant that, for example, this is just one example, that 56% of workers said that they had been given a say, they had a say in making some recent changes. We gave different examples: improvements in the working environment, revised salaries, changes in rules, ceiling fans, or whatever. It was various things in the factory itself. But we asked, what was your role, basically? And they felt that they were given a say, or they had some influence in making that change. So that sort of measure of workers' empowerment, or workers feeling like they can influence some change, is actually, it's surprising in some sense when you consider that kind of what we sort of know and hear and read about in Bangladesh. Well, it's very dismal, the conditions are terrible. You kind of think, well, how could workers have any influence? But in fact, they do have, they do feel that they are able to make changes, however slow it may be. The changes that are being made at the factory level are really due to the role of the workers and the role of the labor movement. In contrast, in Sri Lanka and Cambodia, so in Sri Lanka, 90% of factories are compliant according to the ILO, and this has been the case for some time. I mean, the factory level conditions generally have been pretty good comparatively, as good as it can be in a garment factory. For most, as I mentioned, when we talk to factory workers, for the most part, the everyday, it's a difficult industry anywhere for anyone. But overall, they really don't talk about actual conditions as being awful. I mean, it's okay, it's fine. There are issues like housing, for example, that is often a challenge. In Cambodia, through the Better Factories Cambodia ILO program that's in place, basic standards have been met, sort of for a long time. I mean, that's a requirement of the program. So in order to, continue to export to the U.S., they had to have certain standards. They had to have certain standards in place. So that, again, the Cambodia factories, have the basic standards have been met. But in contrast, I mean, if you actually look at how influential workers feel they are in making change, about 34% in Sri Lanka saw themselves as influential in making any change, and about 36% in Cambodia felt that they had any voice. And this is also, we have a lot of other, sort of qualitative data to show that, in Cambodia, for example, a lot of workers would say things like, we're just not, we're not intelligent enough to have any change or make any influence. We're not, we leave that up to the educated, people, or things like that. So they're sort of told that, you don't have to worry about it. We know what's kind of best for you, and we'll take care of you. And it's a very paternalistic sort of attitude, I think, in both these countries. So this is just a quote from the book. In the cases of Sri Lanka and Cambodia, such positive development in the factories have been seen as justifications for excluding labor from meaningful dialogue about further changes at both the factory and national level. In Bangladesh, though change has been much slower and improvements have been incremental, the workers themselves have been very involved in efforts to affect the changes. So that's kind of a, sort of an interesting twist in some sense, in terms of what we would actually expect in these countries. And then finally, the fourth point was really the top-down programs really limit coalition building. So both Sri Lanka and Cambodia, they are known for their improved conditions, better labor standards. Sri Lanka, so this is the Garments Without Guilt is a sort of a national campaign. It's a branding marketing campaign that really holds Sri Lanka up as as a leader in sort of labor rights and environmental, sort of improved environmental standards, eco-friendly factories. These are all part, sort of tenets of this guilt, sort of Garments Without Guilt brand, I guess. They're trying to sort of brand themselves. And it's a complex system of, monitoring and compliance and you sort of get the stamp that, it's made in Sri Lanka and you can sort of be, guilt-free if you buy the garments here. This is I don't know how well you can see the picture, but this is from a factory in Sri Lanka, which, this does not look like a garment factory. I mean, this was one side where it was all solar panels and there was a lot of natural light and green, a lot of greenery. So very, sort of this eco-friendly factory. A lot of factories we saw were really impressive and again, not like what you would expect a typical garment factory to be. So they really are trying to, make a difference through these types of factories, and to make this as a point that this is what we are trying to establish, trying to promote. But so while that was extremely impressive, you sort of as I was talking to various people, I got the idea. I sort of always started questioning, but where are the workers in all this? Where is the labor force in all this? And you really don't. There's very little discussion about involving labor groups, labor leaders, workers as part of a larger sort of network, as involving them in making decisions, whether at the factory level, and really very few mechanisms at the national level to sort of sit on committees and make policy decisions. So a labor leader, for example, really sort of says, workers are not really, very powerful. And then a factory owner, this idea of collective bargaining is sort of a big, one of the biggest contentions in Sri Lanka. At least, when I was there a few years ago, the labor groups were always pushing for that. They really wanted collective bargaining rights. And an owner, in response to that says, for example, we don't need collective bargaining. There's regular dialogue and suggestion boxes, so there's a mechanism that's put in place. So that's again sort of seen as, we have the employees' councils, we have the suggestion boxes. That's kind of it. We also have better standards. So there are no reason for workers to be more involved, and we know what's kind of best for them. I mean, that was continually sort of said that we know what's best for the workers, and they don't really need to be more involved. In Cambodia, as I mentioned, the Better Factories Cambodia program has been in place, but there's a lot of while it's done, it's been very good to an extent that the factories have reached a certain level of compliance. Again, it's, in some ways it's been sort of an excuse to exclude labor and labor groups from the process, with the idea that, well, the program is in place, we've reached a certain level of compliance, why do workers need to say anything else? I mean, it's just kind of, we will take care of it. So there was a very important report from the Stanford Law School International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic that really studied the BFC program in detail, and really found a lot of limitations within it. It's reached kind of its limit in terms of what it can do now. So there needs to be sort of a next phase. But one of the things they write is, perhaps the predominant narrative of success and incremental progress has shielded BFC and other important actors from doing more to improve the real working conditions that Cambodian garment workers face today. So it's certainly not the case that they are all doing fine. I mean, if you read in the media, you hear about the mass faintings that have been happening in factories in Cambodia and things like that. I mean, there are certainly issues at the factory level that need to be addressed, but there's the labor groups and workers are very limited in terms of what they can, how much they can say or how much they can push. Very, really lacking in sort of significant power. So I don't know how we're doing on time.
Maybe about 5 or 6
5 minutes, okay. So I very quickly just touch on the trade aspect, because this is something, as I was writing this book, as I mentioned, it started off really around the anxiety sort of surrounding the expiration of the MFA. But then there was, so the book kind of starts by talking about that and the effects of the MFA. But the end, it talks about, other policies that are in place that basically, restrict the exports, that continue to, restrict exports of garments and textiles. And so you have very high tariffs. All 3 countries that in the study actually face extremely high tariffs, and they're actually not part of any other trade agreement. So there's not, like, for example, AGOA or the Caribbean countries are in a trade agreement, or various countries, various blocs are in trade agreements that sort of dramatically reduce or almost eliminate the tariffs. But Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka all pay extremely high tariffs when they're exporting into the U.S. And there's also other issues, with the sort of the idea about revoking GSP status, the generalized system of preference status, and using it sort of as a tool to say, okay, you have to improve your labor rights or we're going to revoke our status. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really work. I mean, one, the loophole that Bangladesh faces actually is that garments are not even covered under the GSP scheme, which is very ironic. I think it's, shrimp is covered and a few other things, but the percentage of, exports or the garments is 80%, probably even more, probably close to 90%. So revoking GSP actually makes absolutely no difference, but it's sort of this statement that the administration wants to make to say that we're really pushing hard on, improvement labor rights. But in fact, when Rana Plaza happened, the Obama administration immediately revoked GSP. Yet, a lot of the American brands at that time did not join any of the. Is the Alliance the European brands or the Accord? The Accord. So they did not join the Accord. But this was before the Alliance was established. So there was no sort of statement about that. The brands should come together, or the U.S. should do an equivalent. It was like, let's revoke GSP and then push them to improve. So again, these sort of it's problematic, I think, linking labor rights and human rights to trade and restrictions. It's not a clear issue of how that actually plays out and how effective that is. So without, I won't have enough time to discuss all this, but the last chapter, just does mention these various other restrictions on trade. And this is just a graph I have, which I find always very striking. If you look at, it's just aid from the U.S. and then tariffs paid to the U.S. Of course, Bangladesh as a country is not actually paying this money, but it's the various brands that are paying the money when they're trying to export. But this is actually goes into the calculation of brands when they're trying to source from a country like Bangladesh. When they know that the tariffs are extremely high, they actually put that in. The pressure on costs are even greater. So it is, in effect, it does really hurt the industry over time. But this is, if we're using trade to try to affect development and improve development, this is kind of ironic if you look at these numbers. So the end, I'll just end with what my conclusion really touches on. And again, just because of the timing, there was very little room for analysis, and it's something that it's ongoing. It's where does the industry go from here? And this whole idea, sort of post Rana Plaza, how the idea of this overemphasis on compliance and monitoring, but really ignoring the sort of supply chain issues and the pressure that owners face really to meet their targets as soon as possible, really at whatever cost, and at whatever, sort of sacrificing, improved labor rights, sacrificing improvements to their factories, just in trying to get things out, as quick as possible. And I think the whole industry, I think it's a created industry of compliance and monitoring, is sort of taking away from really looking at what we need to analyze and really how the supply chain works. So just some of the ideas I had for going forward, how to think about going forward. Looking at policies that are productive, not symbolic. So I really think revoking GSP is a very symbolic stance, but again, very ineffective. But again, pushing brands to take responsibility, or other policies that are actually gonna do something. Moving away from this singular focus on monitoring, but address supply chain issues. Why do compliant factories, even the most compliant ones, go to subcontractors that are extremely unsafe? Because they have an overload. They cannot meet the demand that's set by the brands, but yet they don't want to admit that, because the competition that's created is fierce. No one wants to admit that I can't take on this work. They're worried they may not, next season, that brand may not be there. So you cannot expect that, it sounds from our side, when we're sitting here, to say, how can they go to such, terrible factories and put all these lives at danger? But it's not such a simple sort of, calculation. It's actually, becomes a business decision based on the pressures they face. Supporting movements that are already in place. So, for example, the labor movements that I talked about in Bangladesh, rather than working through them, rather than instituting parallel programs, I don't know actually what's happening with there's supposed to be an ILO program in place in Bangladesh. I think last I knew they hired someone, I don't know how much, so it's a Better Factories equivalent in Bangladesh. But, I actually wonder or worry about how that's going to interact with already what's taking place. There's a lot of things that are taking place. Maybe you don't need a parallel program to be, just instituted and doing separate things. It's a lot more about working together and supporting, what is already there, which there is a lot. And finally, this kind of, a lot of northern labor rights groups have really focused on checking the box kind of solutions. They want to increase the number of unions, and then if you do, we'll get your GSP status back. That kind of, just literally sort of checking the box, and it's part of the whole monitoring and compliance industry of going and being able to check boxes and saying this is done, this is done. But again, unions, they're limited in sort of their effectiveness. So 200 unions, labor rights group based in the north told me that since GSP was revoked in Bangladesh, 200 more unions have been established. But maybe that's effective, but maybe it's not too. I mean, we have to critically analyze whether simply increasing the number of unions is going, is that the solution, or do you need something more? So just, to end, what I was closely following, and I'm still trying, I haven't gotten much information on any of these, but these are really sort of interesting things that I sort of found out after the book was written, but it'd be interesting to continue sort of following these things. We were talking about this at lunch, H&M's strategy to purchase 100% of the factories, their production in Bangladesh and Cambodia. I mean, that was their sort of reaction to Rana Plaza. But that's actually one brand that has tried to address the supply chain and not focus only on monitoring. That's a very interesting, strategy. Now, will it work? How will it be, played out? I don't know. I haven't really heard much. I haven't seen much in the media about this. As I mentioned, the new ILO program in Bangladesh modeled after the BFC. Where is that going? How is that going to, what is the impact it's going to have? Protests in Cambodia. So over the last year, this has been an interesting, I think, shift in terms of the visibility of labor groups in Cambodia. I think this is definitely a shift. Of course, the government has been extremely repressive when these groups have been out. But, is this going to change? I mean, I'm almost seeing some sort of, reminiscent of early days in Bangladesh of sort of, labor groups actually being out on the streets. And this is, I think, really important to follow. What are the channels that is it going to change? Are unions going to become more effective? Will there be other mechanisms in place that start dealing with these issues in Cambodia? So those are some sort of issues to follow up on. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so thanks to Sanchita for well-organized and excellent presentation and some very good charts that I'm sure enabled us to follow the story effectively. So Professor Ahmed will now, Fawzia Ahmed will now make some comments as our first discussant. Please, Fawzia.
It's a pleasure to comment on Sanchita's book on the garment industry, a topic which has been a recurrent theme in my own work. The policy network approach, which she argues that both the state and interest groups, and indeed there are many, many stakeholders, have actually need each other, require each other to improve, is important. And I think the vantage point of cooperation is certainly that she has is imperative in the wake of Rana Plaza. And the domestic coalitions approach, which she actually advances that theory, does enable us to examine interactions between groups and the state. And they are critical to understanding the sector's current and future growth. She also defines the strengths and weaknesses of the policy network approach. She defines the parameters based on two categories, communications, channels that not only link the stakeholders with the state, but also link stakeholders with one another. And she's also described, in one of the chapters, she's elaborated on these mechanisms of communications, and that's something that I really like. It's not just, she's given us something to sort of hold on to. As well as exclusiveness, all stakeholders who are important need to be located in the core of the network. And I think her point that I really felt was really intriguing, and I think it's very insightful, that improved labor conditions do not necessarily imply that the labor force is empowered. Is there inclusiveness? And the fact that improved labor standards can be used as a justification to silence labor and to limit mechanisms for dialogue. Now, while I do really like the book, I feel that it does not sufficiently address the issue, and this is something that Sanchita, I think, is aware of, but I don't find in the book, perhaps I missed it, issues of vulnerability and hierarchy that are caused by globalization. In fact, the textile is a buyer-driven globalized commodity chain, not a producer-driven globalized commodity chain. And perhaps some of you are familiar with the work of Jereffi. I can't agree that the buyers were ever an excluded group. Buyers call the shots. And what is excluded is the woman worker and her needs. So there are two sources of vulnerability in the globalized landscapes of the textile industry. The first is that the nature of the chain itself, the structural nature of the chain, and as a sociologist I'm interested in structure, is that the buyer, what does it mean to say the buyer is the boss? It means that the buyer defines the terms of entry for the factory worker. It's a one-way street. And the buyer can exit whenever the buyer wants to. There's no accountability. So I think the question is, given this reality, what is the policy framework? How can the policy approach sort of be developed so that factory owners, I'm not just talking about factory workers, factory owners, because I did interview a number of women factory owners in my study, have more voice in the relationship, especially given that given the nature of the chain, it's the factory that makes cloth into clothes, but it's the buyer that sells the clothes. So the buyer is in charge of the marketing and the ever-evolving consumer niches. Perhaps I also would like to mention another excellent book by Shahidur Rahman, The Broken Promise of Globalization. It's on Bangladesh. And a quote from his book from a buyer is that, from a factory owner, is that buyers buy denim shirts for $30 to $40 a dozen and then sell each shirt for $15 to $20 each. And it's important that buyers offer factory owners a good price so that money can then be used to improve factory conditions, not to mention the wages of the workers. So what could be a policy answer to this problem? What is the incentive of buyers to increase the price per shirt so the factory owner can get more money? What also I think is a bit elided in the book, and I'm speaking about Bangladesh, is in fact the very close relationship between the government and the factory owner. The factory, a certain percentage of factory owners are in fact MPs. Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that.
Oh, right, okay,
in
I'm
the
sorry.
one of the-
I just didn't.
No, but that's an important
Maybe something
point.
I overlooked.
Yeah, it's an important point. Yeah.
And Rabana Haq, who's a factory owner whom I interviewed, said the government has sided with our class interests. And I think there's also another issue is, you know, you'll ask the buyer, well, who's the boss? And the buyer will say the consumer's the boss. Okay, that's the standard mantra. But what about demand creation and fast fashions, which is you have an early summer season. Just go to Ann Taylor's anywhere, you can see that. As consumers, we're aware of that. You have a midsummer, and then you have a late summer. All right, now, it's sort of like a toothpaste tube, where who's squeezing the toothpaste, and you know, in order to meet these fashion, sort of fast fashion, the worker at the other end of at the mouth of the tube is facing this pressure. And then another point was, what about the customer stakeholder?
Yeah.
I think that can't be left out of the picture because, you know, one of the few things that causes widespread activism amongst in the campuses today is this whole idea of the sweatshop and factories. And do people want to wear somebody else's blood on their backs? And are they willing to pay more? Or do they say they're willing to pay more, but when it comes down to it, they aren't? We don't know. More research needs to be done, and consumers need to be included as stakeholders in the policy network. Then the second thing is gender. Although the book does mention women at several points, I think it's important that we think of patriarchy as a system that goes up and down the chain. And the needs of the women workers cannot be conflated with those of male workers. And a focus group, mixed focus group that I conducted in Bangladesh of male and female workers indicated that that male workers, for them the most important thing was an increase in wages. They wanted one thing and that was it. Whereas
That was what?
increase in wages. Whereas female workers wanted maternity leave, they wanted to be paid on time, maternity leave, daycare, zero tolerance for sexual harassment policies, all right? Not only an increase in wages, and I think the question which Sanchita has raised is that all these things that women need, and they're the majority of workers, could be de-emphasized by patriarchal male union leadership. Now, one of the things that I do think is important about the book is she also mentions the Karmajibi Nari Awaj, and these are independent, politically independent unions that are women-led, and be very important to follow their progress. So then, I think that what I really liked is also she mentions that there's a need for a holistic definition of success, which cannot be limited to export, you know, billions of dollars, etc. But I think that she doesn't really define it completely, and I'd like to sort of support that by saying that you have to define it, because policy to what end? Coalition building for what end? That's how you unite people. And I would like to give you, and I'm going to conclude soon, is the case of Bantai as a suggestion of what an ideal factory could be like. And it was Bangladeshi. It's founded in the 1990s by Mohammad Sayyid Rahman, an entrepreneur who had no prior business expertise, but had extensive experience with the Red Cross and Oxfam. Rahman convinced his Taiwanese partner, who held 49% of the share, that women's empowerment and profits could be combined as twin goals of the garment factory. Spacious and safe, the Bantai factory followed health and safety precautions. Salary was always paid on time. Workers were given allowances, house rent, and medical expenses. Overtime was paid double. Bonuses were given for major religious festivals. There was a variety of saving schemes, including, and the Rahman was very aware of the household dynamics of many of these women garment factory owners, and he made a sort of mandatory saving schemes so that women would not be pressured at home to hand over all their earnings to the husbands. They wouldn't, they could say, well, sorry, but this is one of the rules of the factory. If you want all my money, go and talk to Rahman. And then family planning services, a health clinic, a creche, a children's schools, as well as entertainment programs were also provided. Workers were happy. And this was reflected, and this is the most important, in improved productivity, low turnover, and better quality products. In the decade from 1990 to 2000, there was a monthly increase of 10,000 dozen caps. So not only did you get repeat orders, they wanted more. Profit soared. But in 2001, the Taiwanese partner who was responsible for marketing suddenly abandoned Bantai to invest in China because of lower costs. Rahman, who was in charge of production, had little experience of marketing and international buyers. I mean, you can't do everything. Bantai floundered, and he was, after a point, he said he couldn't pay from his own pocket anymore and shut down in 2005. But now we have H&M. And it's a buyer not only is committed to purchasing 100% of the products from companies for 5 years. So the company, and also they're going to pay more per unit product. And I think that together, this example of H&M combined with Bantai could give us clues to what we define as success, what we define as goals of a really good policy for the garment sector.
All right, Professor Ahmed, thank you very much. Very provocative. So this was your first book, right?
Yes.
Well, despite what Professor Ahmed said, I think it's a lovely book.
I think it's a good book too. Don't say
But
despite.
I said it's a lovely book, not a good book. A lovely book.
All right, okay.
And, when Rana Plaza happened, of course, that galvanized so many other stakeholders. We saw all of these stakeholders emerge in a gestalt that, made us all understand that end consumers and the intermediary brand owners, the H&Ms, the Li and Fungs, who are the middlemen and so on. We saw all of that come into play because the microscope was placed on Rana Plaza. And everyone with any connection to that disaster, was suddenly surfaced as a player that was potentially responsible. But before Rana Plaza, not so easy to, as someone writing a first book, to see and cover all of these interconnections. So I think that from the point of view of laying out in a very nice three-country comparison the relative interface between labor and the state and the factory owners, that it's a very nice job. And I think the research methodology that you use, very thorough, and lots of interviews, lots of color brought into the discussion. So I think it's a lovely book. Okay. Now, I just want to make a few comments because you can see I'm wearing a white shirt and a tie, so I'm the closest thing to a business person in this room. Okay? So I want to make a couple of comments related to what Professor Ahmed has said. So what is being produced in these factories, as is clear on the front cover of this book, is very low-grade, commodity-level apparel, right? It's a T-shirt is a very simple thing to make. It's very difficult to differentiate yourself as a T-shirt maker. And most people at the end of the value chain, the consumers, when they're buying T-shirts, unless they happen to have a particular logo, a particular location, you know, when you go on holiday, you buy a souvenir T-shirt, or it's from the Patriots or the Red Sox, you know, unless there's some added value through the logo, if it's just a plain white T-shirt, how much are you prepared to pay for that over and above the lowest possible price you can get it for? And the answer is not very much. And by the way, if you happen to be a shopper at Walmart or a low-priced outlet, you know, you may be someone who's a poorer person in our society who has a lot of other problems and things to worry about, quite frankly, than making sure that they help the worker in Bangladesh who made that T-shirt. So at the end consumer level, you can get a lot of enthusiasm around sustainability and fair trade and all of that if you're dealing with the Starbucks crowd. But if you are dealing with a target audience that is, you know, way below the affordability level at a Dunkin' Donuts, you know, below that, it's, you know, not so easy to get the attention of folks on things other than price. And this then backs up into the channel, the supply chain. Now, at the front end of the supply chain, the producers, how difficult is it to get into this business? How difficult do you think it is to set yourself up as a T-shirt manufacturer in Bangladesh? The barriers to entry are very low, and therefore you have a very fragmented industry at the production level, and consequently the relative power is going to be with Li and Feng and or with the big brand buyers who have the clout to move their production from one factory to another according to the deal that they get. Now, some of those companies, to be fair, I think it's fair to say, will proactively, in some cases, under pressure in other cases, put in place requirements, minimum standard requirements for the factories that they deal with. But it's absolutely true that a lot of these companies found it very convenient to hide behind a middleman, a Li and Feng, in order to distance themselves from any dirty or uncomfortable or discomforting activity that may have been occurring in subcontracted factories, which necessarily are there because of what Fauzi has said. You know, you can't predict, you can predict demand, I tell you what you can predict demand for in terms of apparel more than anything else is men's underwear. Men's underwear is highly forecastable, but women's fashion is very unforecastable. Somewhere in between, there are other items of clothing that you can or maybe not so easily forecast. That's why you need these subcontractors as buffer factories in case all of a sudden demand takes off ahead of what you expected for something. You need 50,000 more in Zara's all over the world by next month, and you've got to get them. If you're the business person running Zara, you don't want to be out of stock of something that's really taken off. So that's what the order comes in, get me 50,000 of those. Li and Feng has to go and find the factories that are going to do it. That results in a lot of practices that frankly these companies don't want anything to do with. And so distancing themselves in terms of ownership, in terms of the contracting and so on is a way that they used to do it. I think one of the great benefits of Rana Plaza has been and will be that there will be more H&Ms that will want to step forward and, you know, take charge of the situation and not delegate randomly to a third party to try and get what they want. But there are consequences to that. So the major consequence will be the following. So H&M decides that it's going to sign 100% deals for 5 years with, let's say, 10 of the largest factories in Bangladesh. That leaves 4,990 factories that are getting no H&M business. What that means is that there's going to be, if that is a trend, there will be consolidation in the garment industry in Bangladesh, because if as H&M I contract with 10 factories, what I want to do is first of all make sure that those 10 are as large as possible, because I don't want, if I'm going to deal transparently with my suppliers, I don't want to deal with 500 suppliers. I can't control that. I haven't got time to waste controlling 500 factories. I want 10 really big ones. So will you please, Mr. Factory Owner, go out, I will help you. I trust you. You have a Harvard MBA in Bangladesh. I'm going to finance you to go out and purchase 25 more factories, build more factories and consolidate the sector. What's going to happen then is, prospectively, a lot of Bangladesh women are going to be out of work who are working at the moment for subcontracting factories and factories that are not going to get into the H&M orbit or the Marks and Spencer orbit or the Primark orbit or whichever one it happens to be. So going down the route of industry consolidation and transparency, as H&M is doing, is on the one hand very laudable, and it will help all of the workers who are lucky enough to end up in those 10 factories. But it will not help the workers who are not lucky enough to end up in those factories, and some of those workers prospectively could be out of work at the end of the game. So those are just kind of a few observations from the ugly world of reality on the ground floor of capitalism. That I always signal who I am, that's the way I do it. Okay, so we have, I hope, provoked a few questions. So now I've got a very serious thing to tell you, okay? And I think you can remember what it is, right? But some of you have not been with me before. So I want you to know what a question is, according to me. So a question is a single sentence that ends with a question mark, okay? A single sentence ending with a question mark. So now I'm going to ask again, has anyone got a question? And if you can't comply, you're going to get off the list, okay? Now, wait for the mic, We'll take the gentleman in blue first, and then the gentleman with the red cap.
Thank you, John.
Don't let me down.
All right. From your findings, did you find any reasons for ineffectiveness of the unions? When I saw 2 different unions is not effective either in Bangladesh or in Cambodia. So what are the reasons for not being effective? Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I answer?
Please.
Amy? Okay. So for different reasons in the different countries. So in Bangladesh, like I said, it's not a blanket statement that they're completely ineffective, but when it has been ineffective, it's largely because they are, they tend to be very male dominated. So what Fauzia's point was, taking into account of the majority of workers who are women, they tend not to take into account their needs. Oftentimes they're run by professional union workers who are actually never worked in the garment factory, so they don't know the reality of that industry. They also in Bangladesh can be very connected with political parties, so it makes them sort of more of a political, an arm of the political party, and they have union members who are sort of, roughing up the, labor force, trying to get them to join. So in those cases, when those unions are in place, they are not effective in actually advancing any sort of, improvements and taking into the account what the primarily, female labor force wants in those cases. So in Bangladesh, those are the reasons. In Cambodia, as I mentioned, it's the sheer number and the inner fighting, and they're heavily politically connected. Almost all of them are. So again, that's not really representing the workers, women or male workers, and it's not really translating their interests into any sort of change.
Okay. Gentlemen.
I need some enlightenment about the concept of registered factories in Bangladesh. For example, did your study cover those factories, even though it's extremely difficult to get data? And to what extent, what percentage of is it possible to give a rough figure as to what percentage of the total production in Bangladesh are unregistered factories, and perhaps what incentives does or lack of incentives does the government give for registration?
Okay.
So registered factories are the ones, so that data is readily available. I mean, the BGMEA and BKMEA, the private sector organizations, have that data. So we got lists from them, and they were able to, when we did our survey, we organized, about amongst the registered factories. We were, so that 5,000 figure, it may slightly change, may be slightly different, but that is the figure, and that is established, through the private sector organizations.
Right.
Now, the subcontractors, which is literally, it can be in someone's basement, it can be somewhere, those are very hard to find. I don't have a good sense. I mean, I know it's fairly large, but I don't know. I mean, maybe Fawzia, you have a better idea about the subcontracting. It's very hard to get data. I haven't even seen
It's
estimates.
very difficult to get data, but I have to say that John's made a very good point, which is from my own research. I went there 3 months after Rana Plaza and got together 17 workers from various garment factories, and some of the conditions, and I think these were terrible. One bathroom for 300 people, naked wires, yes. When I went back, just this December 2014, only 3 of the workers were still employed because the other factories had shut down. And as I was saying over lunch, that's still not the solution.
Right.
That's right.
So your question about incentive to register, I mean, the official factories do want to register because they get benefits of being part of the private sector, and they're, it's all official. So there is that incentive in place.
Yeah. I had just anecdotally heard that about 15% of the total production in Bangladesh was being covered by the subcontractors. Purely anecdotal, though. Lady, please.
I've been in the clothing industry for 40 years. Did you connect what took place here in the 70s and then being able to connect that to, what has happened in these other countries?
In the
Because
70s,
in the sense that
The garment industry
the
here.
garment industry here, what happened to
The
it?
ILGWU you're
Exactly,
referring
yeah,
to,
and
right?
what the unions were
The
able
union,
to,
yeah.
Look
what
for the union
relationship
label.
between union, between government and industry.
Yeah.
That is a very important part of it, because if you don't, it's not accidental what's happening in Bangladesh.
Okay.
This is,
Great,
Right.
great
No,
question.
I know what you're saying, and that's a great point. Yeah, no, the book does not make those connections. It's just a comparison with these 3.
But I think it's very
Looking at
interesting
it,
what you say, because, I do remember that campaign that the ILGWU ran, and you remember it when I said it, right? Look for the union label, right? And the whole purpose of that campaign was, to get consumers who were shopping in the Walmarts of the world to, focus in on, if you like, the broader self-interest of buying union-made product. And it was a pretty effective campaign for a while, but then, of course, the leadership changed and the campaign disappeared.
But I think I'm even talking, I don't know if, that isn't in, that information is not available, is that a lot of unions, the relationship between government, union, and owners of these factories here, it became the relation that unions would, every item that would come from overseas, they would get a percentage of that. And that disappeared after 10
sure.
years. But I think these are important factors, because they went down there to get, things for nothing.
Yeah.
So that relationship to me is very important because it's workers here and workers there that
Right.
need to
You know,
connect.
I mean, it's actually quite interesting when
Yeah.
you look at the pattern of globalization, how inadequate organized labor's response has been. And, you know, corporations have gone global, but trade unions have not gone global. And, you know, we know the ILO is underfunded and, you know, so many countries have signed up to the ILO and don't enforce anything that the ILO stands for, and the ILO has no resources to make them do so. Let's see if there are a couple more questions. Any questions on the aisle? What about the ladies section over here? Anyone got a question? Yes, come on. You know, it can't be just the people around the main table. Okay, so go ahead.
With regards to H&M coming in to Bangladesh and contracting, will that produce more competition amongst the brands to come in? And then what do you predict will happen later on after
Fauzi,
that?
do you want to try that or?
That's a good question, and I think I'll let you try
you
first.
like
No,
it?
or
and then-
John, if you want.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would suggest that, you know, H&M doing this proactively will set a standard, and others will necessarily have to follow that standard. So it will result in other major brand owners doing something similar to what H&M is doing.
Okay, I meant in terms of they're trying to attract the best contractors.
Yes.
But then the other companies will fear losing out on those contractors, and so they'll try to get in and find
And improve you
yeah,
to try to be competitive.
and bring the next best contractors onto their side.
Yeah.
So that fear of losing out on quality producers, is that gonna bring?
I think you know what I think the distinction that I would make is this. Look, H&M has its own retail outlets, so it is it controls totally the pricing and cost structure of its supply chain.
Okay.
You know, the people who are intermediate customers and who are selling on to a variety of different retail outlets that have no brand responsibility of their own, they are still going to continue to operate in the same way as we have seen heretofore, I think, you know, with very little pushback. But when you get major brands that are in control of their entire chain stepping forward and taking responsibility, that will change a portion of the industry. Okay? All right,
Thank you.
please. Maybe one more after this and we finish.
Thank you, John. This is a question to the author. Like, when you started writing this book, or like as it is now, what was your goal? Like, to compare the industry into these three countries, or compare Bangladesh with the other two countries, or what exactly you had in your mind? Like, whether to compare or not compare at all?
So I think, well, one of the goals actually was to present the sector in a slightly different light, and to talk about, you know, some of these aspects of cooperation and coalition building that is evident in all three countries, although in varying degrees. And then it sort of, you know, it came about that these three cases were very interesting comparisons for the reasons I mentioned. You know, some they were doing well post MFA, but there was enough variation to, you know, really compare. You know, Bangladesh is the country that I started working in, but then I, you know, went to these other two. And the goal was really, I mean, you know, partly, actually one of the things I had said before was that I think there certain coverage of this industry, especially Bangladesh, but even, you know, the two other countries, although Sri Lanka, we really see in the Western press almost nothing about the garment industry. I mean, you can rarely find anything. Cambodia, you're seeing a little bit more now because there's more, you know, activism going on. But there is very, and I think people in the West have a particular image of the industry, of workers, of what are the issues. And I wanted to, you know, because just being there and talking to people, you see it always slightly differently. So I wanted to present something that's not, you know, unrealistic and you know, sugar-coated by any means, but something that's a little bit more hopeful, that we may not look at in that way. And also to kind of, also to critique some of the programs that are in place that are often touted as extremely, they are good programs, but they're not without flaws, and they're often not seen as having any flaws. And there are things that are happening in all three countries that oftentimes people don't know about. So I think that was part of the goal as well.
So what would you like to write about next?
Oh gosh, I'm actually moving away from garments, no, but I would like to do some follow-up because, like I said, there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done.
Yeah.
But the next project is that I'm working on is looking at NGOs and local NGOs and international NGOs and how they're interacting. And so it did stem from this book because the whole the role of NGOs have changed, I think, and particularly to the garment sector. But I'm interested in sort of broader issues around development and the NGO sector. Bangladesh would definitely be a case study in this.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So before we end, hands up everybody who thinks this was the best seminar they've attended this year at Harvard so far. Okay, all right. So,
Well, I've heard everything else was canceled, so that's not a fair question. Wasn't everything canceled prior to this?
those of you who put up your hand can congratulate yourselves on your good judgment. So thank you all for coming. Okay.
Thank you.